Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last session of day 3 of TMF Week 2025. The really exciting topic for today's last session, which is all about ICH E6R3 and the impact on TMF. We've got a really great group of panelists here who are going to be discussing everything to do with this upcoming update to E6. And just before I get started with the panel and ask them to introduce themselves, I'm just going to just go through some housekeeping items, which I'm pretty sure at this point you guys have already seen about 20 times, but I will do it again. So all sessions will be recorded and available at the end of the conference. You'll receive a certificate of attendance for the entire week, not for each session. And of course, you can post that on LinkedIn and sort of make some noise about the fact that you attended. And in this particular case, we are going to be looking at questions as we go through the panel. So if you do have questions or even comments, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat, which is on the right side of your screen. And we'll be monitoring that. And as things come up, we will be putting those questions to the panel. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to first of all introduce themselves, and then also just say what they're really excited about when it comes to ICH E6R3. So over to you. I'm going to pick on somebody first. I'm going to ask Dawn to go first.
I saw you coming to me, Paul. There you go. Hello, everyone. Very excited to be here. I am Dawn Nickham. I am Executive Vice President for Quality at Inception Group, and I'm also a member of the steering committee for the TMF reference model. I'm very proud to be on that. So I have a lot of things I'm excited for R3, but one of the things I really love is that everything is risk-based. Everything is about risk-based approach, and really has rounded out what everybody's been saying for years into codified in R3, so that we can think about that for everything we do and all the records we collect, which I think is really great. I'll pass on to the next person. Do I pick someone, Paul, or are you picking someone?
You can pick somebody.
Okay, I'm picking Joanne.
Okay. Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really very glad to be here. I head up the Development Records Management Group at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. I also sit on the steering committee for the TMF reference model. And I am particularly excited about R3 for a number of reasons. First of all, you may recognize my name as being the one who led the risk initiative for the reference model. And of course, that's near and dear to my heart. But I'm also interested in the data governance. As someone who did a lot of computer system validation, this is a passion of mine. So I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about this. So over to Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Dean. I'm Executive Director over Clinical Systems. So I've actually taken on a slightly bigger role within Precision for Medicine to head up the entire clinical systems organization and really tying all of the data together into one location and really to kind of see things across the board. So I really am excited for that risk-based approach. I think especially coming from a CRO, us taking a risk-based approach has always been a little bit more taboo and been a little bit more challenging for us to try to take a more risk approach. So I'm excited just to now have actual guidance out there that really encourages us to do so and then provides us a good framework to do so. Karen.
That's it. That just leaves me. I'm Karen Roy. A great group because we've got pharmaceutical company, we've got CRO, we've got a service provider and a consultant. It's a really nice mixture of opinions, I think. So I'm Karen Roy. I am an independent consultant. I've been part of the TMF reference model since it started. And did everyone know that it's International TMF Day yesterday, which is amazing. R3 is, so I've been sitting at a different conference, nothing to do with TMF, and it's really interesting. There's a lot of discussion about R3, and the exciting part is we've always said we collect too much data, we collect too many documents, and I think everyone's always felt the regulators have pushed us to collect more and more and more and more. And actually R3 is pushing us to collect less. And I know it all ties back into risk and that, but I think the fact that we're not having to collect everything anymore is going to make a huge difference. So,
yeah. And so that I think is definitely very interesting. In the conference that we were at last month in Geneva, there were discussions around that with some of the regulators, and they were saying, our expectation is you take a much more focused approach to your documentation or your records.
Yes.
What I'm really excited about is, number one, well, finally it's here, because it's been a long time. I mean, that's one thing. But the other thing I'm really excited about is the fact that they're being a lot more explicit about computerized systems. In R2, there's this tiny little section, and it's really focused only on data management. And I think it's 3 paragraphs, if that, or 3 bullet points that cover computerized systems. Whereas if we look at R3, throughout the guidance, we're talking about computerized systems, and there's very, very specific guidance around what we should be doing in terms of using these systems, documenting these systems, validating these systems, maintaining these systems, and working with the different service providers. But I think that that's also really encouraging, because I felt that was a bit of a blind spot in our industry up until now. So that's great. So welcome everybody. I'm really excited for this panel. I think that there's going to be a lot of good discussion because we've got a lot of smart people here. I'm going to kick things off with a question around the impact on TMF. So, in your opinion, what are the most important changes that we see in IC 86R3 that impact TMF? And I'm going to let whoever wants to answer go first.
I'd like to give a really simple answer, is that actually we've got standardized names for lots of things. So the fact that documents have become records, and they're records everywhere now, or service providers and is replacing vendors, CROs and things like that. I think we're moving to a world of standards. It's the only way we're going to get efficiency. It's the only way we're going to be able to work with AI. It's only, not necessarily just AI, but all sort of interoperability side of things. So that's it's a small thing, but I think it's a big thing.
Yeah, I agree.
I actually like the fact that they gave us criteria for the essentiality of documents. To me, that's really very helpful, so that we can actually go to the study teams and say, okay, you want this in the TMF, but does it fit any of these criteria? If not, then why?
Yeah. I agree. At first, when I saw that sort of big long list of criteria, I was like, oh my goodness. But actually, when you do read through them, it makes a lot of sense. Dawn,
yeah, and Joanne stole mine. I love the criteria as well, because I agree with that. I love the criteria because I also believe throughout the guidance, one of the things that it really puts forth is critical thinking. So it's not, the criteria, how we do data governance, how we do risk, it's all throughout the guidance. It's not just about being a checklist. It's not about a cookie cutter, one size fits all, but each trial, each study is a little bit different. And each time you need to think about how that impacts what records we're going to collect in our TMF. And then to your point, Paul, which I loved what you said there too about, or maybe Karen said this, less is more, that having the right records in the TMF is so much more important than thinking you put everything and its brother in the TMF, which is what we see far too often. And then it's hard to find things, and the regulators don't like that.
Torsten said that in Geneva, because he was talking about the fact that actually it's much worse to delete stuff out the TMF to say, or than to just not put it there in the first place. Because if you delete, it's like, Well, you put it all in and then you took some out. Why did you do that? It's better just to not put it in.
Yeah, and the other thing Torsten kept talking about, and I don't want to quote Torsten too much because I don't want to put him on the spot virtually, but he did say, he kept talking about proportionality, sort of thinking about proportionality, and that's another thing that we see in R3, right, is a lot of discussion around, you need to take a proportional approach, you need to think very carefully about what you're doing, and that should drive what you're putting in your TMF. So I think that's encouraging that we're hearing that. Similar to what we heard in the early 2000s when it came to CRFs and data management. Right? We used to collect these huge phone books of data, and they're like, no, you don't need to collect all of that. So all of a sudden we started streamlining things. I think that's the era that we're going to in the TMF world as well.
And there's two words, and then I see Sarah wants to say something, but I think quality by design is also, that piece of, because that's where you get your proportionality. That's where you collect the right data. That's where you collect the right records. It's quality by design. You're not collecting superfluous stuff that is not helpful and just muddies up the waters.
Well, and actually, John, what I was going to say kind of goes into that a little bit, because I think historically we look at a percentage-based completeness of your TMF, as a 90%, 60%, like whatever, and then we base so much off of that percentage. But really, in fact, in that percentage might be documents that do we really, in fact, care about those documents to be there? And so it helps to really hone in on the true completeness, looking at what documents are really necessary and required to be there based on the approach that you're taking for that specific study or site. So I think it helped to even hone in more on looking at really what do you need to be in that system versus just a arbitrary percentage that truly can mean a lot of different things. When you actually dive into what's missing, you may not care about any of what's missing, and it actually might be really 100% based on what you care to be there.
Yeah. Absolutely. That brings me on to the next question. So as you all know, and I'm sure that the audience has all read ICHE 6R3 in detail before going to bed at night, there is Appendix C, which has obviously the criteria that we've been speaking about, but it also has some tables which list out essential records or groups of essential records. So my question to the panel is, do you feel that those tables are fit for purpose? And do you see any issues with them?
Should I start? You've already heard me. Yeah, I mean, we did get them to combine the tables. So if anyone saw the draft come out, there was initials, might be essential, and I don't remember how they phrased it, but there was two tables. At least they combined them. I know there were some regulators that were very set on having tables because I had them throw up hands in a conference and say how many people like it, that kind of thing. But my concern is the risk around the table is that people will look at the table and not look at the questions and the criteria. That, the table does not have every record that's going to be needed for the TMF. And some of the records listed in there may or may not be essential, which they call that out sort of, but it goes back to what Sarah was talking about when you look at what are your affected records for the TMF. And if you're looking at a percentage of completeness, if you put that list in there, you're going to maybe have things where you're never going to show 100% complete, or you're going to show 100% complete because you only have that in and you really don't have a full TMF.
Yeah.
I think when you listen to the regulators, though, they do say you need to look at the essentiality. They're focused on the criteria more so than the table. And I mean, they also took out the numbering, which I was very pleased about, because that went back in capital letters. Take out the number, because you can't have two sets. Right? And they did that.
But I do think the table of are they intended as examples, or are they is it concrete? I mean, it's not very clear, I find.
Yeah, I think I think they felt they needed to give people examples, and that's how I think they are viewing it, because of the terminology within the table, at least in some of the entries. It's very general and gives you some, I guess, parameters around the documents that you should actually include. So just as long as people view it that way and not say, oh, here's my complete list of everything that I need to have in the TMF, then hopefully we'll be fine.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, we did ask them multiple times repeatedly if they would not put the table in and if they would actually just reference the reference model.
Right. So that
They
was the question I was going to ask. What was the involvement of the reference model in R3? I mean, what were the discussions that went on and the input?
So actually, I was quite pleased with the amount of input we ended up having. Obviously, the MHRA is no longer part of the EMA. So actually, Jamie Toth and I ended up going to one of the MHRA meetings, feeding back on R3. And surprisingly enough, we sat at the front and we made plenty of noise and we talked a lot about the tables, and we got feedback from all of us as well, which we took to. So we put it out to our community and then took all the comments and took them to the meeting. Specifically about taking the table, as Dawn said, merging it into one so you didn't have the must-haves and the could-haves, getting rid of the numbering, being a bit more defined about investigators, a whole variety of feedback. And I know they went through a lot of pain and arguments about this, because when I was at the latest MHRA meeting, not that I want to name drop, but Andy Fisher came bounding over and went, what do you think of the table? What do you think of Appendix C? Were you happy with it? So I think he thought we'd be quite comfortable with it because we put a lot of feedback into it. And I'm actually quite comfortable, because I think the fact that you've got the essentiality and documents, I think it does enough. It doesn't point to the reference model, but
I know that
most of them, their heads point to the reference model.
Yeah, and one thing that we're doing, and I'll also let Dawn and others give input here, but one of the things that we're doing as part of the V4 effort, we're trying to put in place conventions around the changes that we may be making to the model. And so quite often we find ourselves referring back to R3 to say, okay, well, what are they calling it in R3? What are they doing in R3? How is it organized in that table? So we are referring back to the guidance. We want to ultimately achieve alignment, right, with that guidance as well. Dawn, I don't know if you want to give additional, because I know that you're running a sub-team that's focused on that.
Yeah. And we're really, one of the key things that we are dissecting, literally dissecting the guidance document. We've divided it up into sections, and we have a whole group just looking at this, not just the table, because the table is not complete. And I think thinking of it as examples is a good way to put it, but we need to make sure that the industry is there as well, that they think this is examples and not it, because there are so many records embedded all throughout the guidance document. So we're really taking our time to make sure that we identify those, and that they are suggested to be part of the version 4 reference model or TMF standards, so that we ensure that we're not missing out on things, that we understand where things can go and understand what kind of records we should. So particularly around risk, around sponsor oversight, and then the whole section of questions, making sure that anything that pops out from that, we have that.
Yeah. So I think that's a really useful exercise, because ultimately we want to make sure that we're aligning our vocabulary and the record types that we're defining to R3. It should be really clear when an inspector comes along and looks at a TMF that has been compiled using V4, that it really should link in very, very nicely with R3. So I think it's a really good opportunity. In fact, it's kind of timely that it's coming. It's the same with M11, right? It's arriving at the right time, and everything's sort of converging together. So that's really great. I think also the criteria for essentiality of records, I think has got a lot of value, honestly, and they obviously spent a lot of time putting that together. You guys have read through it. Do you think they're missing anything, or do you feel it's pretty comprehensive? And how would you sort of see yourselves implementing it within your organization?
Yeah, I think overall it's pretty comprehensive. Could there be a few things missing? Sure. But I do think that there's enough flexibility built in so that you can probably find a home for most things.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have been talking about, we have a TMF index that we annually go to all of our stakeholders and say, okay, do you have anything new this year or any changes to your documents and stuff? This will be a good checklist, if we want to call it that, or some sort of a tool that we can basically sit down with them and say, here, let's sort of think about some of these so that we can make sure that you're as complete as you intend to be.
Yeah. It's like a litmus test almost.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, Sarah?
Yeah. So for me, I do feel like similar to Joanne, I do think it's a pretty comprehensive list. I think how at least we envision to operationalize it within our organization is we already have, much to Joanne, have a TMF index, which is based off of the reference model. We have expectations of who is filing, when they're filing, accountability. But I do think then adding this in as another layer of pressure testing what should be there per project, because we obviously go through per project to say what do we define as really required given the indication, the design, the expectations, the countries that are involved. But I think this is now another layer of evaluation to then go back against those questions and to make sure that we're really pressure testing the document, as well as just our organization, where when we're actually setting up, again, to Jen's point, like the templated index that we're going to use and what we're bringing in from the other functions within the organization as standard documents. Do we need to? Should that belong in our TMF? Yeah. So it's really going to come down to taking those in addition to everything else we've already been doing to ensure that we have kind of a somewhat study specific design, and adding those in as another layer of questioning and evaluation.
Yeah, I have a really interesting question from the audience, which is related. So it's from Piran Sujindran. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So what do you predict best practice will be in documenting essentiality assessments for records? So that's an interesting question. So documenting the assessments that you do based on those criteria.
Mm-hmm.
What message?
Yeah, I think I can start with that one. I think that's a great question. And it's really, you're speaking my language of you can do something, but document it, have it documented in some way. I really think that incorporating this activity into your SOP, whether it's part of your TMF index development, whether that's on a study specific or it's more, higher level, as Joanne pointed out, when you go back and look at that, I almost think about it almost like doing a risk assessment. You could, go through this, document who was there, who looked at this, what you were able to determine, and then, how that aligned with what went in your index. And some of it can be documented in the index itself. But I would say best practice is that you show you actually met and who had impact, who had say in what you ended up having, because that's really the critical piece here. Who is making those decisions? Why are they being made? And then how are you incorporating it in what you do? And I almost see using the checklist first before creating an index for study. I mean, that's my head of, we start there. How are you doing all these activities and going through those criteria, and then pulling in, okay, and what records does that align up with then?
Yeah, if I can just add.
Yeah, go for it.
The guideline says that you don't have to document it, which I find most puzzling because usually we have to document everything. I do agree with Dawn. I think it is going to require some documentation, just so that if for no other reason, you remember why you made that decision. Because I don't think it's, well, at least with all the organizations that I've been at, memories fade very fast. And you never can really remember why you did something 2, 3, 4 years ago. And I think it would be very helpful to do that on this type of information.
Joanne, do you think that's doing it as a general, like almost a guideline for the company, or do you think that's more on a study by study basis? Because the problem is a document can be essential on one study, but not essential on another. I just get a little concerned that, which is exactly to Perrin's question, is we've got to be careful that we don't end up creating a whole bunch of new documents because we've got the whole risk thing as well, haven't we? Where we're going to have to do more risk assessments and document them and things. So
yeah, I think you have. Yeah, I agree. I think we have to be careful. And if we're going to do something, you have to do it so that it's sort of simple to do. But I do agree that, everything starts with the protocol and then works its way down. So if we don't consider that on every study, we've sort of lost the guidance of R3. So, it is, our idea was to do it at the high level, portfolio level first, and then for every study, we actually do a study specific index so that we could really hone in on those unusual or unique type of documents.
And I think we also take into account the other factors like proportionality, critical to quality. These things kind of need to be matched together when we're thinking about it. So yes, we have the criteria, but then we also need to think, well, this record may not completely meet the criteria, but it does help us mitigate, and therefore we may want to include it anyway. There's that kind of aspect to it. I have another really interesting question from the audience from Usman, who's been asking a lot of really good questions throughout the week, by the way. So, Usman, at 12:03. So, how do you envision R3 influencing the role of clinical operations and TMF professionals? Will we need to evolve from process executors to critical risk evaluators? It's a good question.
I do some of that needing to be done. I mean, because especially for a lot of organizations I've worked in, we do have then a centralized TMF team that then helps to, work on that index, identify the documents, manage the TMF in general. And so in order to then completely then execute and ensure we're capturing what's necessary, the TMF is complete, they're going to have to then help and support with that evaluation of risk. So I do think that there's going to have to be an evolution there and an understanding of how to do that assessment and how to evaluate whether or not it's needed.
Yeah.
I'm going to actually argue that we should have already been evolving to critical risk evaluators. This is not new with R3. It's been around a bit, but as an industry, we are a little bit stuck on process sometimes. So really trying to think about critical thinking and thinking about what risk is, and then then there is going to be the process, but that comes on the back end based on what your risk assessment was.
Yeah, I tend to agree that I think we want a recipe card of how do I run a clinical study. And to some degree, there is a, sort of a stepwise approach that you do, but not every study is the same. And we have to consider that as we're setting up each study.
Yeah.
Do you think companies are going to end up with quite significant risk departments? So specifically looking at risk across the whole thing, or do you think it's going to be embedded into individual functions?
So I think there already are some of those departments out there. There are like risk groups and that sort of thing. I actually caution that is not necessarily the best way to go, because we all should be thinking about risk. We all should be risk evaluators. So maybe the department becomes the one that helps guide us and ask the right questions and help put the documentation together, perhaps. but ultimately we all need to be able to think critically. We all need to be able to think about a risk-based approach. And I know we're not there yet as an industry, but it's definitely the expectation of how we should be going.
I mean, I think I see the TMF roles changing over time, not just because of R3, also because of, things being influenced by AI, because of digital TMF, data flow and things, and a little bit like the monitor, the CRA and the data manager role sort of got a bit merged. I see other roles in our space becoming merged. So
yeah, no, I think there's definitely an evolution on its way. So another question I have for you guys. So in the current version of the reference model, 3.3, we have a mapping to sections of ICHE 6 R2. And we were just talking about this in a previous meeting. So we've kind of said, okay, well this particular artifact is governed by this section, or maybe these sections, because sometimes it's governed by several. So the first question is do you think we should be mapping the reference model to ICHE 6 R3? And if we are, should we be mapping it to the table of essential records, and maybe even thinking of that table of essential records as the record groups that we can then attach record types to? Is that something that we should maybe think about? Because I know in Torsten's presentation in Geneva last month, he actually had a few slides where he started to do that. He was sort of showing the relation between the reference model and E6R3. So what are your thoughts on that? Should we be doing that? Is that part of our remit? Is it useful to do that?
I can honestly say I never actually used it myself, but when I was on the change control board, we would get a lot of requests to make a change because we had a typo and we had to fix it. So to me, obviously, people use that information to help them in their day-to-day job, or maybe defending the TMF for others. I'm not really sure. But I'd also hesitate mapping it to the table, because if that table is just a list of examples of documents that one would typically see in the TMF, it shouldn't be viewed as complete. So there may be documents that aren't listed there that really are essential for a particular study.
Yeah. No,
I was going to say, I think some mapping would be valuable and helpful, but I think just given the nature of how this guidance document is moved to, again, the risk approach, it's a little bit bigger, that you then have to apply that against your specific study. I think how we apply the mapping is, to me, going to have to be broader to say, okay, this general section or this general zone is something you should evaluate then, and then compare to the questions and see if it really applies. But I do think, because I have referenced this section specifically myself, just specifically to say, no, it actually is not tied back to a regulation. We don't actually have to have this. I question whether or not we should, but it's not necessarily something I think we use completely and all the time. I see value could be in having something there a bit more just vague in general.
I'm assuming, Dawn, when we're doing this whole exercise of ICHE 6 R3 as part of B4, that we're looking at R3 to say, is there anything in there that we're missing that we've not realized about? But I think the mapping, to me, is actually more interesting the other way, which is, here's the reference model. Which essentiality criteria does it meet? Because then you're saying this one meets this question, this one. So you're not doing it the other way around. You're not going, everything in R3 is in the reference model. You're actually saying, here's the reference model. We think it's solid set. How does it tie back?
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, and I guess for the at this point, we were not looking at doing the mapping right now for the current version. That might be a decision we take differently. We've talked about that, but for version 4, I've really said we're going section by section and saying what records should be created. how is this being documented today? What records, will be part of this process? And then looking, is that already covered in a record type or a record group? Is it already there? Yeah, this right here, but do we need to be more specific? So not trying to create tons of more record types, but also trying to be more comprehensive to guide people to say, oh, by the way, and I look at it that way, and that's for my QA hat. I look at it, there's ways that we can guide people to say, yeah, please go document that. And not to document to excess, but to document enough that you have the story. And, we mentioned earlier, like, do we document reviewing those questions? Well, if we don't know how we came to those decisions, we're going to end up redoing that process later on. Because not only do I not remember what I ate 4 years ago, sometimes I don't remember what I had for breakfast, or I wasn't the one that did this 4 years ago is even more common. That team is completely gone. So why were those decisions made? And then at that point, when they're doing a filing, they have to talk to a regulator and say, this is why we did it the way we did.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think being comprehensive is not a bad thing as long as we're proportional. And then I think the thing that's really important that we're doing, and we're doing this both within the working group that you're leading, Dawn, but also as we start to build conventions, is we're trying to align, or we are aligning with naming conventions, so that when an inspector is looking at this, it's not alien to them. We're using the same terminology. And I think all of these efforts, all of these things that we're doing, by doing this alignment, it gives us a better chance later on to get that recognition that we want from the regulator. It gives us a better chance of them saying, okay, this is so well aligned at this point that it makes sense for us to start endorsing this as the standard that needs to be used. So I think it's definitely, what we're doing is essential to that goal. And Dawn, we're right at the beginning, right? We were only just starting this, and as we're going through it, more and more things are coming up, and more thoughts are being had, and we don't have all the answers yet, but I definitely feel we're going in the right direction, and that's great. And we've got a lot of meat to bite into. There's a lot to it. It's a pretty big rewrite, right? So I think it's good. I think it's very clear. So I'm just going to look so we do have a question from a TMF veteran, Fran Ross. Nice to see you, Fran. So I feel like I must ask this question, but it's a good question anyway. Do you see organizations wisely establishing risk principles and strategies at the R&D level yet? Missing an opportunity if I say an eTMF and CTMS are weighted riskier than participant tools like EDC, IRT? So this is, are you seeing risk principles and strategies going across the whole of R&D? This is kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier about having a risk department.
I can speak.
I can't say from my side. Sorry, Sarah, go.
No, I was going to say I can speak for my organization, and we are actually implementing a risk approach that actually does bring in all of our EDC data as well as our CTMS data all into one system, as well as there are some other systems like safety systems that's also going to feed it. So we can have a more comprehensive view at the study level, patient level of the risk, identify issues, concerns, and just areas that we need to focus on and change potentially our approach, our strategy. It is something we're still at the ground floor of, and even honestly trying to work out how does it work across the organization. I do see and have heard, I do think there are more organizations starting to look at this, but I do think, there are just challenges bringing in EDC data. Truthfully, I'm dealing with some of those now, just trying to integrate with how CRFs have been created and maintained and the data points and how they're captured versus how we want to then capture it within the other systems and centralize that data to be able to have a singular way to see it. So I think it's starting, but there are still other conversations that we need to now have on the EDC and IRT side to start actually streamlining a little bit of how they do things, their terminology, the structure, and how they collect the data, because that right there just poses such a greater issue to actually then have that more comprehensive view across the board.
Yeah, I would agree that it's in its infancy. It's very similar in my mind to the audit trail review that, everyone's trying to figure out, so what do we look at? So I do think that people are beginning, and there are pockets of areas within an organization where they are using some risk-based approaches for certain things. But I don't see it being coordinated across the whole organization necessarily. People are looking and saying, gee, that's interesting. Maybe we should do it. But that's about where it is at this point in time.
Yeah. No, I think obviously we will see evolution in this area because we're going to be forced to. And I think even, I was thinking, Joanne, about risk framework that the reference together that you obviously headed, and it's kind of version 1, right? It's just the first iteration of it, where we've been focusing on TMF risk and TMF process.
Right.
But we know that we need to go wider. We know that we other data points that come from elsewhere. We know that we need to be looking at study risk overall, and what are the risky areas of the study that's going to drive our oversight processes within TMF. So I think it's really just the beginning, but at least we've started. That's the good news, right? We've started. So now it's time to continue on. All right.
Can I ask Paul just to add to this? So just a little piece of this. All of this is TMF. So we talk about the eTMF versus CTMS and EDC and IRT. At the end of the day, that's all part of your trial master file, right? They're all TMF repositories in what happened. So, when you start thinking about all of this, what does my whole of all my TMF repositories look like? You should be, implementing similar risk across that, and what are riskier or what are more difficult to get your arms around. Maybe they do become higher risk, or what becomes more important at the end of the day. And they all are important. For the most part.
Yeah, I think it needs a bit of a mindset change too, right? I mean, we don't always, well, we do as TMF professionals, we're always thinking about all of the different repositories, but a lot of the other groups are not necessarily thinking in that way. And so we do need to have a bit of a mindset shift as well. We're getting very close to the end, and we could talk forever about all of these things, I'm sure. Karen, I'm going to let you go for it.
Sorry, it was just a quick comment that I was going to have. I see a lot of new roles coming out of this, not just in terms of like the risk departments in companies, but I see like people having sort of deciding strategies, or vendors taking on challenges. So one of the things that was raised in Geneva was someone said, well, what about all the risk-based software that's out there already? Why can't we just use that? And I see things popping up that have not necessarily been used before. So I think it's an interesting time. It's an interesting time as well for people out there looking at how they could approach things in a different way, because people are going to need guidance. Everyone's a little unsure. We did the risk panel. Everyone was a bit like, well, what do we do? How do we know it's going to be okay? And I think to come together, and I'm sure as a reference model, we'll have more stuff over time. As you said, it's version 1. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I also think there's an opportunity for some of the vendors to innovate in this area as well to better support.
Absolutely.
All right, so I've just got one last question for you guys. So obviously we're just getting R3. I don't expect us to see R4 for a while. Right? Never know. But
not what this will work.
Hopefully when R4 comes along, we'll be sitting on a beach somewhere. But basically, if there was anything that you would like to see in R4, what would it be? Something that's not in R3 that you would have liked to have seen that you would want in R4.
The only thing I can think of is artificial intelligence, and concerns or considerations around how to use or validate or verify, whatever term we'd like to say, how to really use that appropriately, moving forward. And I'm using artificial intelligence as a big bucket. So it's,
I think in general, guidance in general is kind of lacking that, right? There's a new thing just came out from FDA that I need to look at, but you're right, it's not there in R3. Any other thoughts from anyone?
Well, hopefully M11 will be out, and so hopefully what they can do, what R4 would actually incorporate the flow of M11 as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for R4, they started with R3 to get aligned with the other E principles like E8. I think getting aligned across the E family even more, we're still not there. So, seeing that continue to evolve, and so that it becomes really one voice rather than all these discrete guidance documents out there that don't necessarily talk to each other.
Yeah, I agree. I think with Sarah, any other ideas? Obviously, there's a lot of stuff.
No, I honestly, I think Joanna, your comment about AI is to me where I'd be, want to see at least and understand more of the expectations from that side.
Yeah,
and maybe also the endorsement of the reference model.
Standard, right?
We'll just keep at them.
We'll keep them.
Until eventually I'll just get fed up and give in.
Well, guys, unfortunately we are over time, and that was a really great session. Thank you all for giving your insights. As you can see, I think we're all excited about this, which is a good thing, right? Being excited about legislation is always a bit strange, but a good thing because I think we see the opportunities here, and that's what we need to kind of hold on to. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. My colleague Kim will be bringing up a slide which announces tomorrow's first session, I believe. Kim, yeah, okay, great. That works. So day 4. So we've still got 2 full days of TMF week to go, and day 4 is all about TMF culture and operations. And so the first session is going to be at 9 o'clock Eastern time, so 3 p.m. European time, 2 p.m. UK time. Tomorrow, whose job is it anyway? The TMF roles and responsibilities game show. So I think it's going to be a fun session, very interactive. So if you're looking for some light relief, definitely join that session tomorrow and participate. And with that, I would like to once again thank all of our panelists for an excellent panel and wish everybody a lovely afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Speak soon and see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.